All right, it's 2 o'clock Eastern time. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see a number of people here on our session. Thanks for sharing where you're calling in from. I want to welcome everyone to today's session on vertical development. My name is Raymond Lee, and I'm the president with Career Minds. We are the sponsor of today's webinar. And Career Minds, we're a global outplacement, leadership development, executive coaching, and career development firm. As I mentioned in the chat, I'm calling in from Philadelphia. So I'd like to really personally welcome all of you to today's session, and a special shout out to our clients who are on the call today. So before passing things over to Ryan, I want to just touch on a couple of housekeeping things before we start. We are recording the session, so we're planning to send out the recording as well as posting it online. So feel free to share it with your colleagues or anyone on your team that you feel is appropriate. Next, we're going to be using the chat feature. Hopefully you're comfortable with that. So at any point during today's session, if you feel like you have a question, please post that there. I will be monitoring the questions, and Ryan, I'll just pepper in questions if I feel it's appropriate, as you're moving through today's presentation. So without further ado, I want to take the opportunity to introduce Ryan Gottfredson. I've had the personal privilege of knowing Ryan for many years now, since he wrote his first book, Success Mindsets, and now his second book on vertical development. Ryan is a cutting-edge leadership development author. He's a researcher, he's a consultant, and helps organizations vertically develop their leaders primarily through a focus on mindsets. He's a Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author of his book, Success Mindsets, which is a fantastic read. It's the key to unlocking greater success in your life, your work, and leadership. And The Elevated Leader, leveling up your leadership through vertical development, which is going to be the focus of our session here today. He's also a leadership professor at the College of Business and Economics at Cal State University of Fullerton. So, Ryan, it's great to see you again, my friend. Welcome back.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this. And I'm going to set the stage here in just a minute. But even before I do, I want to better get to know you so I could best speak to you where you're at and what your emphasis is. So, and as Raymond mentioned, we want to use the chat functionality. I'm going to do a lot of questions in the chat box, so looking forward to your responses. But let's start with this one. What are the following options best describe you? We've got an internal leadership developer, meaning you work internal to an organization to develop leaders. B, you're external to an organization, a consultant or coach to develop leaders. And or C, you're just simply here because you want to learn how to become a more elevated and effective leader. And of course, you can have multiple answers there, but want to kind of gauge where we're at here. I'm scrolling through the chat box. If you see me look off to the side, that's because I'm looking at the chat box. Good. I appreciate your participation. Getting a lot of A's and a lot of C's, and then a smattering of B's. All right, so we're kind of across the board. We'll definitely be able to speak to everybody, and I think everything that we'll cover is in alignment with where you are at. And to get us into this, here's how I want you to think about the next hour. I'm curious, give me a yes or no. Have any of you read any of Brene Brown's books? This is the one that's on the top. I've got all of her books stacked over here to my left. Anybody read Brene Brown? We got a few yeses here. Suzanne, not yet, not yet. You'll get there. So I really love Brene Brown's books and her work. In fact, I would consider her books to be books that have changed my life. And here's the reason why I believe that they've changed my life, is because, at least for me, her books aren't, here's a to-do list of things that you need to do. But what her books did is she got me to think differently about myself and differently about the world. And because I thought differently about myself and the world, that changed me. It has changed how I navigate the world. It's changed how I make decisions, and it's changed my strategy in terms of how I approach my life, my family, and my leadership. And so when I think about our time together, that's the effect that I want to have. We don't have enough time to get into the to-dos. We'll leave you with some options to dive into that if you want to. But what we ultimately want to do is help you change and elevate your thinking. So that's hopefully going to set the spirit of our time together. And of course, we're going to be focusing on leadership development. And here's a few reasons why we do this. Of course, there's 100 different reasons, but a few reasons why we focus on leadership development is because we know that leaders largely dictate the engagement and performance of employees. We also know that leaders set the ceiling for the groups and the organizations that they lead. And when we understand this, we know that if we can elevate our leaders, then we can elevate our organization and the various groups that the leaders lead. But if we can't elevate the leaders, we may not have any effect on elevating the organization or the groups. Syed, I'm seeing your comment. This one is just rising strong, but I would recommend any Brene Brown book there. So thanks for your question. Yeah, has a great podcast. So good. So we know that leadership development is a way that we can leverage the organization to become better. But then I think a question we've got to ask ourselves is, how good of a job do we do with leadership development? So I want to get your answer to this question. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Most leadership development programs are not as effective as you would like them to be. Yeah, we all seem to be in agreement. It just seems like the return on the investment isn't quite what we want it to be. And we're not alone, of course. And of course, I don't know if we'll ever be perfect. But here's what we know, is we know that organizations spend a lot of money on leadership development. We also know that 75% of organizations rate their leadership development programs as not very effective. And 71% of organizations don't trust their current leaders to navigate their organization into the future, right? We're not getting the impact that we want with our leadership development programs. So effectively, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to talk about why that is. And I want us to get us to think about leadership development differently so that we could strategize around leadership development in a higher, more elevated and effective way. In fact, that's our purpose, is I want to provide you with some novel insights that will allow you to transformationally elevate your leaders. So as an outline, I'll explain all of these, but this will serve as our outline. I'm going to walk you through 3 different frameworks. And I believe all of these frameworks have some novel insights. For some of you who know me that I see on the call, some of this will be a repeat, but I imagine for many of you, these frameworks will be new, and they will cause you to think about leadership development in a different way. So let's start with this first framework here on the left. And to get us into this framework, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 8 individuals, and they are people that I imagine you will recognize. And I'm going to ask you to put an answer in the chat box of what do these people have in common? All right. So here's the 8 people. If you don't know them, we've got Bobby Knight on the top left here, a former head coach of Indiana basketball, my alma mater. Michael Jackson, Naomi Campbell, Gordon Ramsay, Lindsay Lohan, Bill Clinton, Tiger Woods, and Shia LaBeouf. All right, what do these have in common? They're famous. Amy, I agree with you. They're all elite in what they do. High skill or talent, good. Famous, they're known. What else? They have brands around them, many of them, yeah. Great communicators, charismatic. Diane, all of these are good. Diane's getting at one of the things that I wanted you to touch on, which is they've all been involved in some sort of controversy, right? While we see them as great at what they do, there's kind of a but or an asterisk about them, right? And what this allows us to start to feel into is this first framework. One of the things that's really helpful for me to understand is that there's 2 different sides of ourselves. There's our doing side. This is our talent, our knowledge, our skills, and our abilities. And what these 8 people seem to have in spades is they seem to be really high on their doing side. But because of the controversial aspects of how they've operated in the past, it leads us to question the other side of them, which is their being side, which is more about our character and our psyche. So we have these two different sides of ourselves. And of course, we're going to apply this to leadership development, but I want us to feel into this framework just a little bit more before we do so. So let me ask you some questions related to this framework. Let's start with this one. Where do you think most people fall? Is it quadrant A, quadrant B, quadrant C, and quadrant D? When I say most people, this is out of the entire population. Let's say of like North America, for example. Where do you think most people fall? A, B, C, or D? Unfortunately, we're not saying D, right? We want them there, not saying D, but I'm seeing a little bit more B's than anything else. Let me share with you, at least I'm going to pull from different streams of research to share with you that I believe that most people fall in this A level. In fact, what we find is that researchers who study talent, skills, and abilities, what they find across a population is in a given area, that what we'll find within that area is a distribution that looks like this. It's called a Pareto or a power law distribution. Let me give you an example. So I am not a musician. I do not sing. I do not play any instruments. My daughter is in piano. And if I'm being honest with you, she's not very good, but she's better than me. So on this distribution, you think about musicians, is that most people are like me. They don't really sing and they don't really play instruments. That's most people. My daughter's somewhere down the line, but not too far down the line. It's not super talented. But then there are people who are extremely talented. In fact, more so than what would be predicted under a normal distribution. For example, you got people like Beyonce, who has over 30 Grammy Awards. In fact, there's several dozen people who have over 10, or groups who have over 10 Grammy Awards. But the vast majority of musicians have never won a Grammy. So when you think about, musicians, we could think about tennis players, we could take any different field, we could even say leadership developers. What we will find is a distribution that looks like this on the doing side. When it comes to that being side, we also find that same distribution. In fact, I'm going to talk more about the research that goes into this. But what researchers have found is that 64% of all adults operate at a low level on that being side. We'll also define a little bit more what that means here in just a little bit. And then 35% are at a second level, kind of midway up, and only 1% at that top level, which suggests that sort of a distribution. So that's just kind of an entry into this. Does that make sense? Give me a yes or no if that makes sense to you. In fact, I just looked it up the other day. What percentage of the United States and Canada have graduated from college? And what I found is that so about a third, maybe a little bit over a third of people, right? That would, in terms of this distribution on the doing side, that would maybe put us about, halfway or a little bit more along this first segment. And that puts a third maybe above and beyond in terms of knowledge, skills, above others. I'm not saying that people who don't go to college aren't knowledge and skillful, but as a whole. But that doesn't necessarily make them, if I have a college degree, doesn't make me super talented, right? I think we kind of get that. So good. All right, so that's quadrant A. Let's look into this quadrant in the top left, the low doing and high being. Any examples come to mind for you of people who operate in this quadrant? Professors, possibly. Possibly, I would say. I know a lot of professors that I wouldn't put there, but you don't want to attend our department meetings. They're usually a high degree of a lack of emotional intelligence, from my experience. Doctors, lawyers could be, right? In fact, I just met Amy, as you're saying doctors, I just recently did a training with leaders at Chalk Children's Hospital here in Orange County. And the leaders were all physicians who are moving into administrative roles. And in fact, what they said to me is 100% of their training during their residency in medical school was all on their doing side. They said 0% was on their being side, right? Good. Amy, people deceived by their own perception of themselves. Could be, right? In fact, when I think about people who are high on this being side, these are people who have a strong regulatory abilities. They, even despite stress or bad circumstances, they're able to stay calm, cool, and collected, but may not be super talented. Like what comes to my mind is like a monk, right? There's somebody that I would go to for advice. I would want to learn from. I think I could gain a lot of wisdom from them, but I'm not sure I want them as the leader of my organization, right? So nothing wrong for anybody operating in these levels, but that's just what comes to mind here. When we think about the high doing side and the high doing, low being, any examples come to mind here? Gail, CEOs, many I'll reference, right? Yeah, Amy, yeah, doctors and lawyers for this one, right? Could be trade workers, yeah, good. Yeah, surgeons, right? So what we actually find is that most leaders operate in this quadrant. They've gotten to a leadership position because they have demonstrated a certain degree of talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities. But that doesn't necessarily make them exceptional on that being side, right? If I take a doctor, for example, they may know how to do some cutting edge surgery, but their bedside manner may not be very good. And that would be more revealing of their being side. And in fact, I just did this workshop or presented this framework to a group earlier this week, and I asked for examples. And one example that came up, if you're familiar, is Lee Iacocca, the former CEO of Chrysler. And we kind of said, look, Lee is probably quite low in this quadrant, but there's some depth here, right? Somebody who I would say isn't in the quadrant above, but probably higher than Lee Iacocca in terms of the being side is somebody like Jack Welch, right? And you can look at like Kenneth Lay and Jeffrey Skilling with Enron. I'll probably put them on the really, really high doing, but really low being, right? As demonstrated by their willingness to engage in fraudulent activity when stress occurs. So this is where most leaders reside. Now, let's now think about any examples that come to mind of people who are high on the doing side and high on the being side. Yeah, reminded of Martin Luther King this week. Yeah, I would agree, at least in my study of him. Others, examples of high doing, high being. Good, Mother Teresa. I've got a question. I want to see a few other examples come through. Obama, which one? Right? Maybe both. Both Barack and Michelle, right? I've really enjoyed reading Michelle's books in particular. Good, right? This is where our stereotypical great leaders reside. Oftentimes we'll hear things like Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa comes up pretty commonly. Abraham Lincoln, for example. So, as I spout off these names, here's a question for you. Do you think that these individuals are higher on their being side or higher on their doing side? And when you think about these stereotypical great leaders, generally their power and their influence comes more so because of how high they are on their being side and less so about his doing side. That isn't to say that they aren't really high on their doing side. It just seems like it's their being that really exudes. Hopefully you connect to that. Kind of a more modern day business example for me is Satya Nadella. seems to operate in this quadrant. And if we've got time, I'll come back to him as an example later on in the presentation. Other examples that come to mind are people like Indra Nooyi with PepsiCo, Mary Barrett at GM, Alan Mulally, former CEO at Ford, Ed Catmull, founder of Pixar Animation. These are some of the other examples in terms of my study of them seem to be operating within this quadrant. But the reality is that most leaders operate here in this doing side. So as we look at this framework, let me ask you two questions. Here's the first one. What do you think? Are most leadership issues related to the leader's doing side or being side? So if you think about leadership problems, things that you've seen maybe in your organization, in other organizations, or in the public sphere, where do you think most leadership issues reside? Is it more on the doing side or is it more on the being side? It's generally more on the being side, right? You get some examples like Sam, is it Fried Bankman or Bankman Fried? I always forget, with FTX, right? So that's a big issue. It seems to be more of a being side issue than a doing side. Seems to be a really intelligent individual. But here's the second question for you. What side does most development efforts focus on? Yeah, it's the doing side, right? And in my mind, this is the big disconnect of why our leadership development programs aren't paying out the way that we want them to, is because they are largely focused on this doing side. But what we really need the most help with, what leaders need the most help with, is that being side. So the most transformational side to focus on is this being side. Well, then the question becomes how? Now, just to be honest with you, my perception is that we haven't really been trained on how to focus on the being side. We know how to focus on the doing side because our education systems, our athletic programs, and most of our organizational development efforts revolves around the doing side. People don't have a lot of knowledge or experience about this being side. So I want to dive into how we go about elevating on this being side and helping others to elevate on this being side. And to do that, that's going to introduce us into this second framework. So what we need to understand with this second framework is that just as there's two sides of ourselves, there's two different forms of development. One form of development that focuses on the doing side that we are rather familiar with is what we can call horizontal development. But there's a form of development that focuses on the being side, and that's vertical development. So let me define these for you and help you to kind of feel into them. So horizontal development is just simply adding more knowledge, skills, and competencies to what we have. The focus is on doing more. It's kind of like adding an app onto an iPad. When we add an app onto an iPad, that's great because that iPad can now do more than what it could do previously, right? For example, if you take an accounting class in college, now that college is that accounting class is all about horizontal development. I want to add the accounting app so I can do accounting things. But just because I have that accounting app on my iPad, does that improve my ability to navigate change, pressure, uncertainty, and complexity? No, not at all, right? But if we want that type of development, we need to use a different form of development, and that's vertical development. Vertical development is not about adding apps onto our iPad. It's all about upgrading our own internal operating system. And what I've got here is our formal definition of vertical development. It's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll unpack it here in just a minute. But it's elevating our ability to make meaning of our world in more cognitively and emotionally sophisticated ways. Now, there's a lot to it, and we'll kind of unpack that here in just a second. But just to remind you that our focus here is not on doing more, it's on being better. So let's step into this definition briefly here. So I want you to pay attention to these terms that I've underlined. We've got make meaning in different with different levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication. So I want us to feel into that concept there. And to do that, let me ask you this question. Put your answer in the chat box. How would you say most people respond to constructive criticism? Mika, quick, right? Defensively. Why would we get defensive? What does that say about how we make meaning of that constructive criticism? What it suggests is that we see the constructive criticism as an attack. That's how our body, probably at a non-conscious level, chose to make meaning of that. And when we make meaning of constructive criticism as an attack, naturally, we're going to get defensive. That makes sense. But we've got to ask ourselves the question, is that cognitively and emotionally sophisticated? No, not really, right? The next level up might be, this might be an attack. Therefore, it depends on who delivers it and how they deliver it, right? If it's my boss and they deliver it tactfully, awesome. But if it's my spouse and they don't deliver it tactfully, they are sitting on the couch, right? Or sleeping on the couch. So that's a little bit more cognitively and emotionally sophisticated. But what about this top level, right? The people that are highest on their being side are people who see constructive criticism as an opportunity to learn and grow. They may recognize that the person giving the constructive criticism may be their worst enemy who is malintended, but yet they still create space for using it as an opportunity to learn and grow. And that allows them to embrace it. Now, this is just kind of a microcosm of this idea, how different people can make meaning of a single thing with different levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication. But it also paints something that's really important for us to understand about our being side. Is as there is a continuum here as we go from bottom to the top. At the bottom is we are self-protective. As we move towards the top, we become more value creating. And this is ultimately what the being side is all about. It's what our character is all about, or at least one way to define character, is our degree to operate as a value creator as opposed to a self-protector. And when push comes to shove, when stress when we're feeling stressed, things are hitting the fan, to what degree are we able to stay in value creation mode as opposed to self-protection mode? Right? So that's one way for us to think about this being side and think about character, which I find helpful. I'm going to give you a more in-depth framework for that here in just a little bit. But what this allows us to understand is that we can create a three-dimensional image like this of ourselves. How much knowledge do I have? How much skills do I possess? And what is my level of being? What is my vertical development level? What is my vertical altitude? What is my level of character? And of course, it's going to be valuable to go out in all directions. But I might argue the most important of these is this being dimension. And here's one of the reasons why, is because what I've learned is that the higher we are on our being, the more we get out of our knowledge and skills. And so while we may have really talented people in our organizations, when we help them elevate on their being side, they're going to get even more out of their talent and skills. Does this make sense? Vertical and horizontal development. If any questions pop up, feel free to throw these in the chat box, but we're about to transition into our third framework. This is our second one here. So just want to check in, give me a yes or no if this is making sense, and if there's any questions. Yeah, Amy, this is emotional intelligence is a being side characteristic. Unfortunately, all too often in organizational trainings, we try to make it out to be a horizontal characteristic. But the reality is it's a being characteristic, because we cannot have emotional intelligence if our body is wired for self-protection. If we want to have emotional intelligence, we've got to rise above our body's natural inhibitions for self-protection. Awesome. Good. All right. So we're connecting here. So good. We got one more framework here to help us to dive into this. But what this third framework will allow us to do is it will allow us to assess and evaluate our altitude along our being side. And this framework comes from the same field that brought us this concept of vertical development. That the field is the field of developmental psychology. Now, developmental psychology has been a field of study since the 1880s. And the vast majority of developmental psychology focus and research has been on child development, because we could largely see children develop right before our eyes. In fact, most of the history of developmental psychologists just assumed adults didn't develop. So we'll tap into that. But what we know from the field of developmental psychology is that as children go from infancy to adulthood, they go through a number of different stages, 5 or more depending on the framework. They develop rather automatically. It's essentially a function of their age, and their pace of development is quite quick, right? 5 or more stages in about 20-ish years, right? That's pretty quick. But as I mentioned, most developmental psychologists assumed that adults didn't develop. But in the 1960s, a select few developmental psychologists started to ask the question, can adults develop? And if so, do they go through different developmental stages? And what they found is that yes, adults can develop, and there are 3 adult development stages. But what they also found was that most adults actually don't develop in adulthood, suggesting that development as an adult is no longer a function of age, but rather a function of effort. And the speed by which we develop is really contingent upon how much effort we put in and investment in a wide variety of ways. But what these adult development psychologists have effectively identified is a framework for measuring the altitude along our being side. And in fact, that's what they've done, is they've looked across all adults, and what they found are these statistics that I presented earlier. 64% of all adults operate at that base level of adult development. 35% get to level 2, and only 1% gets to level 3. Now, when we look at executives, these percentages are interesting, and they're quite different. What we find is that vast majority of executives operate at that second level. Less than ideal, not that it's terrible for the most part, but less than ideal. Only 8% seem to operate at that highest level. So I want to walk us through each of those 3 different levels. But I see we've got a question here in the chat box. What does vertical and horizontal development have to do with culture? I think culture plays a role in how we approach each of those things. I would say in terms of our Western culture, is the culture values the horizontal development because it allows us to check box. I have a degree, I won an award, right? It helps us to be able to check boxes. In the Western culture, we don't do as good of a job of connecting to our being side as what I've observed on more Eastern cultures, for example. Yeah, Saeed, about growth mindsets is mindsets are a being side characteristic. They're connected into our body's nervous system and how we are wired to interpret and make meaning of our world. So good. And in fact, when I work with organizations, mindsets is the primary thing that I focus on to help leaders with their being side. Aaron, good question. And I would suggest a related correlation with wealth. At least, I don't know. My hunch is that no, the answer is no. I would say mostly level 2 people are the ones that are the most passionate about wealth creation. Level 3 people are more passionate about purpose fulfillment, which doesn't always lead to wealth creation. So that's one perspective related there, Aaron. Good. All right, so I wanted to help us to, Lisa, do you find executive coaching helps bring that percentage up for leaders? If it focuses on vertical development, then yes. If it focuses only on horizontal, then I think it's a maybe. I think there can be some tangential vertical development benefits by focusing on horizontal development, but as a whole, we're largely limited. But so I think that's a niche. If we're a coach, vertical development really can be should be a valuable niche for the work that we're doing. Good. All right, so let's step into these 3 levels here. I love these questions, by the way. Good work. Let's step into these 3 levels. To get us into this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 slides with a whole bunch of words and phrases. And I'm going to ask you a question related to, does this feel like a great leader to you? So let's start with this first one. This is slide A. I'll kind of let you read through these different words and phrases here. And answer this question for me in the chat box. On a scale of 0 to 10, to what degree does this feel like a great leader? So 10 would be a great leader and 0 is not a good leader at all. Where would you put these types of characteristics, if you will, or modes of operation? Good. We're seeing quite low numbers here. I think I saw 4 was the highest, 0 is the lowest. All right. So that's slide A. Here's slide B. And you could go ahead as you read through these, rate on that same scale. 0 is not a good leader at all. 10 is a great leader. Where would you put these type of leaders? We're getting a wider range. I've seen a 2 and I've seen an 8. But most of them seem to be middle ground, right? We're not getting as many 2s and 3s, but we're getting a lot more 5s and 6s, right? We're feeling like this is a little bit better. I imagine there's 2 people who wrote 2. They could see some of the negative effects of people operating with this emphasis. And I see the people who see 8s, they could see some of the benefits of operating with these types of emphases, right? There surely is some pros and cons here. Good. Let's step into C. Good, Gail. I'm glad you picked up on that. Yeah, B is very competitive. So where would you rate C here? All right, immediately we're starting to get some higher numbers here. It doesn't make them perfect, right? But these generally seem to be the types of things that we want from our leaders. I guess let me ask you this question related to A, B's, and C's. Where do you feel like most leaders operate? Is it A, B, or C? Right? We should feel that it's B. In fact, 85% of executives seem to have these types of a focus, right? There's one executive team that I've worked with. I asked the COO, how do you measure success in your business? And she operates in a healthcare space, and her answer was double-digit growth year over year, right? That was like B to a T. What she didn't talk about was the impact that the organization was having on their customers, patients. Good, right, Gail? It's easier to measure stuff through this B perspective, measure results and outcomes. I'm glad you're picking up on that. It's harder to measure purpose and progress towards our purpose, right? Good. So there's some incentives for leaders to operate in B. I'm glad you're feeling into that. But what this helps us to identify, there's really kind of 3 different types of people. There's what I would classify as good soldiers. These are really good people. They don't want any bad things to occur. They want to play nice. They don't want to be wrong. They don't want failures to occur. They don't want to rock the boat, but they want to fit in, right? For them, they kind of operate more in survival mode. They don't want to be told, they want to be told what to do, but they may struggle taking initiative, right? So that's what we would call good soldiers here at this base level. At that second level, we could call these progress makers, right? I want to stand out, advance, get ahead. I've got metrics that I want to hit. I've got milestones that are really important. And that's where my focus is. And then we've got value creators. These are people who are mindful, balanced, centered. They are purpose focused. They are willing to, hopefully you could sense this, they are able to tamp down their need for self-protection and step into things like vulnerability, complexity, new worlds, innovation, new ideas, right? We've got a lot less self-protection, which allows them to be more, I'm going to use a Brene Brown term, courageous, So these are the 3 different levels. I use the terminology Mind 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 because at each of these levels, our body is wired differently. It's wired to fulfill different needs. And as we upgrade our internal operating system, we change our needs. We'll step into what I mean by that here in just a second, but let me revisit the statistics here associated with these levels. Good. All right. So let's step into these 3 levels. Let me help them come to life for you here. So let's start at this first level, Mind 1.0. And now, as I mentioned, is that at each level, our body's internal operating system is programmed to fulfill specific needs. At this level, our needs are safety, comfort, and belonging, and fitting in. Now, whenever we have needs, we're also going to have threats to those needs, and those show up as fears, right? People at this base level are afraid of being exposed, being uncomfortable, and not fitting in. Now, whether we are here or not, we have all been here, right? So we should all be able to relate to this. Some hallmarks when it comes to Mind 1.0 individuals is they like to join and identify with groups because that helps them to fulfill their needs and quell their fears. It helps them to feel more safe, more comfortable, and like they belong. And when they join these groups, they don't say, I want to take charge. They say, hey, can I be a part of the group? And in fact, why don't you just tell me what to do? I'll go and do it, provided you keep me safe, comfortable, and feeling like I belong, right? I don't know about you. I've been there. In fact, I think I became a professor because I wanted some safety and some comfort and some belonging, right? Built into the tenure system, right? That's something I could see that definitely played a role in me choosing my career path. So people at Mind 1.0 generally operate as dependent thinkers. What our bodies here at this Mind 1.0 level is wired to get to the center of the huddle, right? That's where we're going to feel the most safe, the most comfortable, and the most like we belong. And our biggest fear is like being, if you could see my cursor, this sad little penguin on the outside, because they're unsafe, uncomfortable, and they don't belong. So that's Mind 1.0. Give me a yes or no. Does that make sense to you? Or if it doesn't, any questions that pop up? Great. Yeah, so Mika, this research was inspired by Maslow's ideas. It doesn't map on exactly, but it was definitely inspired. So you're going to see some of that connection there. Good. All right. So jump into Mind 2.0, as I mentioned, what we're going to see is an upgrade of our internal operating system such that we're programmed to fulfill different needs. The needs here are to stand out, advance, and get ahead. And you'll recognize how transformational this is because people at this Mind 2.0 level is they're willing to be unsafe, uncomfortable, and not belong in order to stand out, advance, and get ahead. They've got a wider window of tolerance for being unsafe, uncomfortable, and not belonging. And of course, as their needs change, so will their fears. They start to become fearful of being obsolete or redundant, failing, falling short and losing, and falling behind. Do you know any leaders that happen to have those fears? Right? Those are pretty common fears in terms of what I've been able to find in working with the leadership groups that I work with. So when we're at this level, we are no longer a dependent thinker. We actually become an independent thinker. We have our own good ideas and we want to put them to the test. We're willing to push back against our group's beliefs. And when we have our own ideas and we want to put them to the test, we want to step into leadership positions to implement our ideas, right? That's the natural byproduct of moving up into this level, is we want to become or be put into leadership positions. And we recognize that there may be a whole lot of Mind 1.0 people that are willing to help me stand out, advance, and get ahead. So there's a reason. This would be a good explanation for why we see a decent amount of ego when it comes to high-level leadership roles in organizations. So when we're here, we don't want to stand in the huddle. What we want to be is we want to kind of be up on the hillside where we can direct those below us, but also be seen and recognized. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the most common characteristics that I see from Mind 2.0 leaders later, but hopefully that gives you just a good introduction here for Mind 2.0. So give me a yes or no in the chat box if this is making sense or if any questions are popping up here. All right, good. So as we get into this third level, again, we're going to see a shift in our needs here. Remember, Mind 1.0 is I want to stand in, or I need to stand in. Mind 2.0 is I need to stand out. At Mind 3.0, we don't care about standing in and we don't care about standing out. What we care about is contributing, adding value, and lifting others. Yes, we are going to have some fears, but these seem to be healthier fears. I fear not taking from or not impacting. I fear not being of value, and I fear limiting and stifling others. And when we're here, we're not dependent thinkers and we're not independent thinkers. We are interdependent thinkers. With Mind 2.0, 1.0, and 2.0 people, their minds are focused on the short term, standing in or standing out in the short term. Mind 3.0 people are focused on the long term. This allows them to think through a longer time horizon, be more strategic, and a more complex thinker. They see and value the systems that go into the outcomes. So we've got a much more sophisticated leader and thinker when we operate at, or they operate at this Mind 3.0 level. And to stretch our, forgive me, I just realized I have an image that's off of this, but if we want to stretch our penguin analogy, I think a Mind 3.0 penguin would look like a farmer penguin. And here's why I say that, or something along those lines, is because penguins, where they incubate their eggs is 30 to 50 miles away from their food source. The male penguins who incubate the eggs lose half of their body weight in the 2 months that they incubate those eggs. So a Mind 3.0 penguin is somebody who says, well, there's a huge need for food. What if I could bring the food to these penguins? I want to do that not because I want to stand in more, and I want to do that not because I want to stand out more. I want to do that because simply that's a great way to contribute and help others. And that's more of that Mind 3.0 mentality. And so that's this third framework here that helps us to now evaluate our altitude along our being side. And in fact, let me just draw a line here. When I think about that, remember the 2x2 matrix that I shared earlier, there was a line that designated high and low along that being side. If I was to draw that line here, here's where I would put that line. And here's why I say that is because when we operate below this line, what are we wired to focus on? Right? When we're below this line, we're focused on ourselves, either standing in or standing out. It's only when we're above that line that we are now focused on something bigger than ourselves. And Gail, you bring up a great point. In fact, I've been fortunate to get to know Alan Mulally, former CEO at Ford, and he's latched onto this framework. And here's the reason why, and it's related to your comments, Gail, is he said, when you look at boards of directors, they are largely made up of people who have been really successful in their career, largely from the progress maker standpoint. So he says, my experience is that most boards of directors are Mind 2.0 leaders, and their number one job is to select a CEO. So if they're going to select a CEO, who are they most likely to select? Somebody who speaks the same language that they do, other Mind 2.0 leaders. And he says that he thinks that that's one of the biggest issues with organizations today. And I'll give you an example of how powerful it is when we get a Mind 3.0 leader. I mean, Alan Mulally is a great example of that with Ford. He would also say his predecessors are not Mind 3.0 leaders, and thus Ford hasn't been able to maintain the momentum that he created when he was CEO. But good insight. Yeah, the focus on revenue outcomes, that incentivizes that Mind 2.0 perspective. So what that requires of Mind 3.0 leaders is they've got to recognize, okay, there is value in tracking revenue, profitability, EBITDA, whatever it might be. but we've got to maintain our focus on purpose. Yeah, Chris, I'll have to look into Siegel. All right, I'll have to look into that. Good. Yeah, good question, Gail. So there is a flaw. I'm going to call it a flaw or a limitation to this framework. In that, and to get us into that, let me ask you a question. How many of you see all three mind levels in yourself? Or at least multiple mind levels? I know I do, right? So this isn't like cut and dry. We are only spending 100% of our time in one of these levels. Let me give you another way to think about it. We could consider our center of gravity. What percentage of our time do we spend at each of these mind levels? And I think that this is a really powerful way of thinking about it, right? Both of these perspectives, when you think about the pyramid as well as these three circles, it's all about evaluating where we're at on our being side. We can think about that more cut and dry, or we can think about it in a more nuanced way. But regardless, when we understand this, our focus in terms of our development of ourselves, as well as that of the leaders that we work with, should be about helping leaders or ourselves spend a greater percentage of our time in that Mind 3.0 level. Are we going to be able to spend 100% of our time there? Probably not, right? But we need leaders and people to spend a greater percentage of their time there than what they do. So hopefully that concept also helps, it's not white and black. It helps us bring in some of the gray associated with this perspective and framework. So as a whole, these two things together, I think, are really helpful frameworks for evaluating the altitude of our leaders' being side. And in fact, one of the things that I've developed here is a vertical development assessment designed to help people identify their center of gravity. It's free. You could use it. You could use it with the leaders in your organization. In fact, if you want to use it in your organization, I could create a unique link for you so we could pull the data and look at that data at a collective level and say, collectively, where are we at in terms of our primary center of gravity? So there's a QR code there you could scan. I imagine I'm pretty sure Raymond confirmed, we'll be sending out the slide deck and additional resources as well. So any questions here? I know we've got we probably got about 5 minutes left. There's a couple of ideas I want to wrap up with, but let me stop there. Any questions related to this framework?
Hey, Ryan, we had a question that popped up earlier that we missed, and it was a general question. It was, when did vertical development become important?
Yeah, good question. So the term, to my understanding, I've tried to dig into this. To my understanding, the term vertical development was coined in about 2011. The source of that I could find is a gentleman named Nick Petrie, who at the time worked for the Center of Creative Leadership. And he seemed to coin the term, and it's built off of the prior 50 years of developmental psychology research. Some of the big players in that space are people like Robert Keegan. Now I'm having a big fat brain fart. Bill Torbert, and a whole bunch of, a handful or about a dozen other people. So he kind of built off of the foundation they had laid, and to my knowledge, he's the person that I've seen that has coined that term. If you know somebody else who has, I would love to know. So vertical development really hasn't been on the radar at all. And I feel like it's just now starting to come on the radar. We've got me, who has written a book. There's several other books that have now been written related to vertical development. So good question. All right, well, let me close up. We may have a few other time for questions. Here's one of the things I want to do, is I just want to do quickly compare and contrast what a Mind 2.0 leader looks like compared to a Mind 3.0 leader. And what I observed in the leaders that I work with. I think a great example could be the difference between Steve Ballmer and Satya Nadella. I won't go into the details here, other than you can look at the slides when we're done. But Steve Ballmer seemed to have operated more as a progress maker. Satya Nadella as a value creator. And the effect of that is we look at their stock price. It's one way to measure. Is since Satya Nadella has taken over, their stock price is up, I think, over 8 times now, or pretty close to that. But the key differences that I find are these. Mind 2.0 leaders are results focused. Mind 3.0 leaders are purpose focused. Mind 2.0 leaders are short-term focused. Mind 3.0 leaders are long-term focused. Mind 2.0 leaders are fruit focused. They want the outcomes. Mind 3.0 leaders are foundation focused. They want to create the environment that produces the fruit. Mind 2.0 leaders lead with control. And Mind 3.0 leaders lead with context. And Mind 2.0 leaders struggle with complexity, whereas Mind 3.0 leaders thrive in complexity. And I'm curious, just a quick poll, where do your leaders have the most room to operate out of those 5? You could say A, B, C, D, or E, or any combination of those. Good, yeah. And we're going to see a smattering of that. And of course, they are interrelated. In fact, I think all 5 of the first answers were different results. Okay, good. So we are out of time. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was not going to be a session about here's what to do, but it is hopefully about here's some novel insights that I think can transformationally change how you go about elevating the leaders that you work with and support. In fact, if you're willing to share, what of these insight or frameworks that was discussed are you finding most interesting? We've got A, B, C, or D there. Good. Leaning towards the right side of that, which is good. I hope you see the value in A and B in terms of setting us up for understanding C and D. So, of course, like I said, this was not going to be about what to do, but how to think and strategize differently about leadership development. But of course, I, as well as Raymond at Career Minds, would love to help you and support you in developing your leaders further. I work with organizations specifically on vertical development on this being side. Raymond, this is the time I'll let you come back in. Feel free to wrap up anything you want, as well as touching on the different things that Career Minds can do.
Absolutely. And Ryan, thank you so much. Well done. I feel like everyone found a lot of value out of today's session. Really, really appreciate your time today. And yes, if anyone's interested in learning more about Career Minds leadership development, executive coaching, accelerator programs, we use the vertical development framework in terms of coaching around that Mind 3.0 and really leaning into the being side. So if you're interested in some information, please reach out. There's a link that we posted. And again, we will be sharing materials, the recording, the presentation. So be on the lookout for that. And again, Ryan, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Appreciate your time, all the work that you're doing on this incredible topic. So thank you for that. And to everyone, have a great rest of your week and stay warm. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.